Freshly showered and wearing clean clothes, Paul Tyler strolled along a Morgan City street with his friend Scott Jeske, feeling like $1 million. I can't believe it! I catch the winning touchdown pass and get a date with a dreamboat to boot. Have I had a good day or what? Dusk was settling down over Morgan City, cooling it a bit. The streets still smelled of hot dust and car exhaust fumes, and people exuberant from the football victory had returned to repopulate it, walking home or perhaps doing a little bit of shopping. "That's the 4th time you've said that, man," said Scott. "I admit I'm proud of you, pal, but if you pat yourself on the back anymore, your arm's going to fall off." "Sorry, but I just can't believe it," said Paul. "I'm really happy. Like, really, truly. You know, it's not often I get to go out with someone I really like. It's hard enough to ask plain girls out, but Meg Penny? Sheesh, my brain is getting foggy just thinking about her." "Nah, it was just all at tackles today. You'll be fine, Tyler." Then Scott seemed to notice something. He snagged the crook of his friend's elbow and dragged him off toward a row of small stores. "Come in here. Stop in here for a moment." It suddenly registered with Paul that Scott was dragging him into the Rexall drugstore. "What are we doing here?" Paul asked. "I gotta go home and get ready." The door chimed as they walked in. The Rexall store was clean and neat, but its narrow aisles were heavily stocked, and the effect was rather claustrophobic. The place smelled of syrups, powders, antiseptics, and chewing gum. Scott pulled Paul along down to the drug counter in the back, his voice lowered to just about a whisper. "Lend me $5 just till tomorrow." Paul was aghast. "What for?" Scott's narrow lips formed into a self-satisfied smile. "You know, you're not the only one with a date, pal. I'm bound to score with Vicky tonight, and I gotta invest in a little protection. No telling what bugs are creeping around town tonight." Paul stopped in his tracks, doing a double take. "Vicky? Vicky DeSoto? The girl most likely to make Penthouse Pet of the Year? And if she made Playboy, they'd have to have an L-shaped gatefold to fit her all in." No, he didn't buy it for a moment. "You're gonna score with Vicky DeSoto?" Scott beamed. "That's right. I understand women like Vicky," he said with a conspiratorial wink. "They're like frying pans. You gotta get them hot before you put the meat in." "You're a true romantic," said Paul, feeling pretty disgusted, but amused nonetheless. "Come on, spot me a 5, Scott persisted. A voice called from behind a stack of tampons. "Come on, boys, it's closing time." That would be the pharmacist. Paul could see a mound of graying hair bobbling near the cash register, below it a pair of horn-rimmed glasses. Exasperated, Paul dug into his pocket, pulled out his money. He separated a 5 from his thin stack of bills and handed it to Scott. "Just make it quick." Scott grabbed the 5 and sauntered confidently to the back, while Paul turned to the magazine rack and picked up the latest Time magazine. Carl Sagan was on the cover, framed against a picture of the Milky Way. The words read, "Outer Space. What's really out there?" Paul just hoped that whatever was out there, it wasn't as creepy as his friend Scott Jeske. Yup, he was going to score tonight, no question, thought Scott Jeske as he strode past the rack of aspirin and painkillers to where the pharmacist stood, a surly expression causing his mustache to curve at the ends. Clearly the guy wanted to go home, which was okay with Scott, since this wasn't going to take long. "Hey, look, pal, give me a pack of Trojans and a Banaka spray." Somewhere behind him, the door chimed, another last-minute customer. The pharmacist seemed to be considering Scott's request, looking as though he thought as soon as they kick the kid out and serve him. Finally, with a contemptuous grunt, he turned away to get the stuff. Scott waited, drumming his fingers on the countertop, trying to disguise both his nervousness and the rising excitement about tonight's date. He had his mind set on dating Vicky DeSoto for weeks, and tonight was finally the night. A man walked up behind Scott and plopped a package of contact on the counter. Out of the corner of his eye, Scott saw a dark suit and a white clerical collar. Above that, a balding head. "Holy shit," thought Scott, "it's my minister." Reverend Frederick Meeker, pastor of All Souls Lutheran Church, gave Scott a beatific smile. "Well, Scott Jeske, good game today." For a moment, Scott felt as though he were frozen in his shoes, caught by his own minister buying a pack of rubbers. Sheesh. This was the guy who'd christened him, for Christ's sakes. This was the guy who lectured him about sins of the flesh and desires of the heart. He just prayed that the pharmacist was going to put his stuff in a brown paper bag. "Thanks, Reverend. How are you doing?" he managed through a rigid smile. "Well, my hay fever's acting up, but I'll live." The Reverend pursed his lips. "You know, I haven't seen you at Sunday services lately, have I?" "Oh, well, said Scott, but he got no chance to continue since the pharmacist had reappeared, displaying 2 bright red packs of condoms. "You want the ribbed or the regular?" he asked. "Oh no! Unless he got brilliant real fast, his mom was going to get an earful of this." Scott thought, hemming and hawing. Then inspiration struck. "Ribbed, I guess. They're not for me." He ventured to look at Reverend Meeker. The guy's eyebrows were raised so high it almost looked like he was growing his hair back. "Oh?" he said. Scott pointed over to Paul, immersed in a magazine. "No, they're for my friend over there." The pharmacist and the Reverend both craned their necks to get a good look at the guy in question. Their reaction encouraged Scott, and he forged on. "Yeah, he's planning to take advantage of some poor girl tonight. You should hear him talk about it. Disgusting." The pharmacist looked doubtful. "Why doesn't he buy them?" "I had to drag him in here as it is. The guy is totally irresponsible." He slapped his $5 down, wanting to get this over with as soon as possible, and get away while he still had these guys actually believing his story. As if sensing that people were staring at him, Paul looked up from his magazine and called up to his friend. "Come on, Scott, what's the hold-up? I don't want to keep this girl waiting. I told you." "Perfect." Scott shrugged to the pastor as if to say, "See? What did I tell you?" Reverend Meeker seemed to believe Scott's story, looking down at the aisle at Paul with concern and compassion. The surly pharmacist shook his head. "That boy doesn't need condoms. He needs a muzzle." "You really can't blame him, sir," said Scott. "It's the school food. Far too much glandular reactives, I say. I think we ought to get the FDA in to check it. Me? I always brown bag it." He got his change, snatched the sack, and tipped an imaginary hat. "Well, gotta run. Maybe I can discourage him from the error of his ways." The pastor looked as though he wanted to ask Scott if he was going to start coming back to church, but seemed too stunned to get the words out. The pharmacist just gave a disgruntled look and started ringing up the pastor's purchase. "Well, get the stuff," said Paul, putting the magazine back on the rack. Scott slapped the sack. "You bet." "What were you talking about with the collar there?" "I was just going to settle for plain rubbers, but good old Reverend Meeker, he highly recommended the lubricated sort," he grinned. "He says he liked them bright red, too." Shocked, Scott looked back over his shoulder. Good grief, he must have gone to Jim Baker University. It was controlled chaos, as usual, at the Penny household, a 60s-style colonial nestled in a cluster of similarly modeled homes. Peg Penny, the mother, was trying to deal with the remains of the evening dinner, carting dishes into the kitchen and sticking them into her GE dishwasher. At the same time, she had to cope with the baby, gurgling away in her high chair, as well as 2 10-year-olds who were playing with their desserts. Meanwhile, George Penny, the father, was rattling around with his stereo trying to get his favorite station tuned in to accompany his evening's paper reading. And Meg Penny, older teenage daughter and ace cheerleader, was running around on the upper level, rooting through drawers for the right clothes to wear that evening, making all kinds of noises when those tried-on clothes didn't look right for her date with Paul Tyler that night. When Peg came out of the kitchen to get the next load of dirty dishes, she found her 10-year-old son Kevin balancing his entire square serving of lime jello on his spoon, with his pal Eddie Beckner looking on with glee. Before she could do or say anything, Kevin stuck his mouth onto the jello and with one mighty suck inhaled the entire glob. The action was greeted with a squeal of approval by Christine the baby. Eddie Beckner, who had disdained his own green jello, opting to eat only the whipped cream on top, applauded. "Kevin, don't eat with your face," said Mrs. Penny. "We're in a hurry, Mom," explained Kevin. "We're going bowling with Anthony." All enthusiasm, Eddie piped up. "And then to the movies." That news stopped Mrs. Penny cold. She didn't approve of most of the movies they were letting young kids in to see these days, and she was more than vocal about the matter. "What movie?" she demanded. Kevin, well aware of his mother's opinion on the subject, kicked his friend under the table to shut him up, but Eddie's mouth was already cruising along at full speed. "Garden Tool Massacre! Your basic slice and dice." Mrs. Penny did a double take. "Your basic what?" "This guy in a hockey mask chops up a few teenagers." And then he noticed Mrs. Penny's reaction. "But don't worry, there's no sex or anything bad." Peg Penny was still an attractive woman, but when she frowned, as now, the severity of her expression gave no hint of her beauty. "No, absolutely not." "Mom, come on," said Kevin. "Kevin, I will not have you seeing that kind of trash, and that's final. Do you understand?" Kevin nodded sadly. There was no use in trying to argue with her. when she had that kind of a face on. "Yes, ma'am." Pegpenny had just turned to deal with baby Christine, who had tossed her spoon onto the floor, when another crisis erupted, this time from upstairs. "Mom!" Meg, her daughter, called down from the second-story landing. "Have you seen my pink sweater?" Yes, she certainly had seen Meg's sweater. Pegpenny cringed. "It's on the hamper, honey," she said, heading for the stairs. "I meant to talk to you about that." Leaving the children to their own devices, she started up the steps to deal with her teenage daughter. Meg Penny, meanwhile, was going through the hamper. A flash of pink. A blur of fuzz. She plucked up the cashmere fabric and was staring bemusedly at it when her mother walked into the room. The thing looked like it had shrunk. "What happened?" she asked. "Well," said Mrs. Penny, "I'm afraid it got mixed up in the wash. I meant to do it by hand." "Maybe it will stretch back," said Meg, slipping it on over her bra, trying to get the bottom down to her blue jeans. Alas, it went only to her midriff. Meg stared down at it a moment and then looked up at her mother. "It's an interesting look." They both laughed, and Mrs. Penny was clearly relieved at her daughter's reaction. Generally, they got along very well. Of course, there was the occasional tension, inevitable in a situation where a daughter was inheriting a mother's youthful beauty, while mom traveled into middle age. Inevitable also due to the fits of independence typical of adolescence. But still they had a lot in common. Meg and Pegpenny, they were somehow good friends. "I tell you what," said Mrs. Penny, "why don't you wear my Ann Taylor blouse?" Meg was taken aback. That blouse had cost a lot of money. "Really? Are you sure?" "I'm sure," said Mrs. Penny. Meg was very pleased. She would look good in that blouse, and she wanted to look nice for her date tonight with Paul Tyler. She figured her father would like Paul. He was always telling her to date guys with that straight grin. The funny thing was, that was the part of Paul that she never liked much. He seemed just too normal, but then when she joined the cheerleader squad and she got to talk to him a little bit, she found that beneath those Midwestern good looks, he was actually an interesting individual. So when he'd asked her out today, she not only said yes, but she was thrilled at the prospect of dating him. Suddenly the doorbell rang. "Oh my God, that's Paul," she said. "Now, you're sure he's okay, dear?" "Paul is the kind of guy Daddy wants me to be going out with, I'm telling you. A straight arrow. But can you deal with the door? I'm going to be very late getting ready." "A woman's prerogative, Meg. I'm sure your father is dealing with the door. I'll just go down and check." Mr. Penny, however, had just settled down in his lazy boy with his paper and was not about to get up and answer any door. So the task was left to Kevin. He swung it open to find a teenage boy looking very nervous and smiling too broadly. "Yeah, what is it?" Kevin asked. Hi, said Paul Tyler. I'm here to see Meg?" "What for?" asked Kevin, not really interested. Still grumpy because his mother wouldn't let him go with Eddie to see the movie. Well, just to see her. Is she home?" "Just a minute." The door slammed shut in Paul's face. He took a deep breath, let it out, telling himself to stay calm. He didn't want to blow this date. Surely it was his most important so far. When the door opened, an older version of Meg looked out, smiling, which made Paul feel loads better. "I'm terribly sorry. You must be Paul. I'm's Meg's mother," the woman said. Turning on the politeness to full power, Paul said, "Nice to meet you, ma'am." Mrs. Penny beckoned him to enter. "Come on in. Meg will be right down." As Paul entered the nicely kept home, Kevin Penny tried to squeeze out the open door along with Eddie. Mrs. Penny caught Kevin by the back of his collar, spinning him around in a challenging manner. "And where do you think you're going?" she demanded. "To Eddie's. I'm sleeping over, remember?" "Okay, but you're not going anywhere without your jacket," she insisted. "Oh, Mom, it's boiling out." "It's September, and it's nighttime. You're wearing your jacket." Kevin stomped to the nearby closet and pulled out a light gray nylon jacket, which he tossed over his shoulder. "Put it on," his mother demanded. Kevin put it on and tried to zipper it up, but the zipper jammed halfway. "Stupid coat!" Paul watched, feeling like a third wheel, as Mrs. Penny descended upon her son in a mother-henish manner, giving the zipper a few hard tugs until it surrendered to determine motherhood and shut all the way. She bent over and kissed Kevin on the cheek. "Bye, honey. Enjoy yourself." The moment Kevin and Eddie escaped through the door, a crash sounded from the kitchen, followed a second later by the wailing of a child. "Oh, Lord, Christine," said Mrs. Penny. "Excuse me, Paul." She hurried back to deal with the accident, leaving Paul to his own devices. He looked around. Nice house. Typical suburban, a lot like his own, but with a touch of individuality, plus some class and style. The same classiness showed also in the oldest product of the penny union, Meg. The traits that Paul liked most about her were her poise, her sense of style, plus the obvious intelligence and wit she showed in conversations. Suddenly there she was, bouncing down the stairs in a pretty beige ruffle blouse that suited her perfectly. She wore a bright, welcoming smile, and most exciting of all, Paul thought, she looked extremely pleased to be going out with him. "Hi, Paul." "Hi, you look great." "Thanks." "Ready to go?" "Oh, yeah, I've been looking forward to it, but I want you to meet my dad first. It'll just take a second." Paul shrugged. No problem. Dads were one of his specialities. Somehow he found that he knew how to handle fathers. Just talk about football and compliment them on their home and family, and they'd love him. Paul anticipated. No trouble here. No trouble at all. Meg took him into the den, where a man lounged in a reclining chair immersed in the newspaper. "Daddy," said Meg, "I'd like you to meet Paul." The newspaper lowered. Paul recognized the man in his horn-rimmed glasses and neatly clipped mustache immediately. It was the pharmacist from the Ruxell drugstore. "Hello," said Paul, extending a hand. The man did a double take and then looked as though he were about to bite off Paul's hand. "You." "At me? What?" Paul took a defensive step backward. Mr. Penny stood up and started waving his paper at Paul. "You? You're taking my daughter out? No, not after what that Jesky boy had to say about you. No way." Meg looked totally baffled, but Paul immediately guessed what had happened. "Sir, I can explain." His precious date with Meg Penny at stake, Paul Tyler explained for all he was worth. On the way into town, he'd been lucky and snagged a ride in Clint Ziegler's pickup truck. But despite a great deal of thumb-wagging, no one else had stopped to pick up Brian Flagg on his way back to Elkins Grove. Finally, he had to walk the whole way around Route 9 and then another mile until he reached the dirty, dry riverbed, lugging old Moss's ratchet set in his pocket. He should have brought a flashlight, too. He thought he'd approach the familiar skeletal stump of the bridge he'd tried to use as a ramp. The sun was long gone, and night had clamped down tight on the countryside. There was a full moon, however, and from it enough light to see what he was doing. There were just a few adjustments that he had to make on his bike, and he'd worked on that machine so much he probably could fix it in the dark, just by touch. In the distance, a dog howled. From closer came the hoot of an owl. A cool, dry breeze was blowing down from the mountains, swaying and rattling tree branches in the forest. Nearby, and pushing the smell of pine and dead leaves into Flagg's face. And the smell of something else. Brian Flagg paused by the ruined bridge and took another sniff of that air. Yes, there was something else, a burning smell. He surveyed the tops of the trees, and yes, there was a trace of smoke, coming up from just about the area where the can man lived. The old man must be having a barbecue, thought Flagg, or burning refuse or something. Nonetheless, the smell made him feel slightly uneasy. As he looked at the wavering smoke against the night sky, the hairs at the nape of his neck lifted a bit, and he shivered. The mountain countryside could spook a guy once in a while. Injun ghost dances, some people called the sensation. Flagg just shrugged it off and went down into the gully to deal with his bike. It was still there, of course. There was no danger of anyone wanting the thing. Brian had paid a whole $25 for it, almost as soon as he got it dumped in the city junkyard. But then it looked hopeless, rusty and dilapidated. The frame was good still, and the tires were almost new. Otherwise, it was a mess, but Brian Flagg had a talent for spotting potential in old stuff. Now the bike meant a lot to him because he'd saved it. It was almost like he'd made the whole thing. He hauled the bike up, pushing it up the gully slope at any angle so the wheels could get some purchase. It was a struggle, and when he finally pushed it up over the rim, he was puffing heavily. When he had his breath back, he wheeled the thing to some flat ground near a strand of trees. Here, he not only had optimum use of the moonlight, he also knew the damn bike wouldn't roll away from him. He put the kickstand down, crouched, and opened up Moss's ratchet set. Straining to see it in the dim light, it began to work. Suddenly he heard a soft rustling sound. Flagg tensed, looking around. It had been an odd noise. He listened a moment longer. Hearing nothing more, he went back to work, ignoring how greasy his hands were getting. More rustling. This time, however, it was closer. It seemed to come from the trees to his left. A twig snapped. and Brian paused, holding his breath as he listened. He heard nothing more. Flag slipped the ratchet into his pocket and flipped the ratchet box close. He flickered on the motorcycle's headlight and panned it across the base of the trees and surrounding field. Nothing. Damn, this was creepy, although nothing to get upset about, of course. The night was always full of odd sounds, and this valley could do weird things with sound, thought Flag as he clicked off the light. That sound could be coming from... He turned around and found himself staring into horror. Wild shrunken eyes, an open mouth, silently screaming, crazed tangle of hair. Flag gasped and stepped back. It was the Can Man, and he looked as if he had just been through a meat grinder. Abruptly, the scream broke loose, wretched and hoarse, and the Can Man's mouth was wide open. He brought up his arms into the moonlight, and Brian could see that one held a rusty hand axe, and the other was wrapped in something weird. Something smooth and reddish with speckles and sparkles. Flag didn't get a good look because the Can Man turned and held the hand out. He took the hand axe and made an erratic swing at his own arm. The axe blade glanced off the forearm, doing not much harm. But God, was the guy nuts? He was trying to cut off his own hand. Another scream ripped from the Can Man's lips, and he pulled the axe back again for another try. God, he had to stop the loon, thought Flag, racing up and catching the axe. With several hard yanks, he managed to wrestle it out of the old man's grip. He hurled it away into the brush, where the guy couldn't get at it again. The Can Man screeched, shuddering with agony. As Brian spun him around, he could see the guy's eyes actually rolling with the pain. It was that thing on his hand. What the hell was it? Hey, old guy, be still. I'm trying to help you, he cried, surprised at the scrawny man's strength. Flag managed to raise the arm up in the moonlight to where he could get a good look at it. Boy, the old lunatic had done something with the axe. The forearm was shattered and mangled. And on the other hand, oh Jesus, what was that? The old man's hand was cocooned with a thick oozing mass. Translucent, it looked like a jellyfish wrapped tightly and stubbornly with a strange glitter to it, an odd pulsing. But inside, Flag felt his stomach churn. This translucent gunk was colored a squeezy pink, and though the pink showed what was left of the Can Man's hand, skeleton, with just a shred of muscle, a faint wrapping of vein. Even as Flag stared down, transfixed in revulsion of horror, the mass moved slug-like up to the new slash the man had inflicted with the axe, staunching the blood and clogging the dent. There was a faint sucking sound. The Can Man howled. Flag, distracted, no longer had a good grip on the old man, so he was able to break free. Off balance, stunned with what he had seen, Flag staggered back as the Can Man charged back off into the woods, screaming like a madman. Flag recovered. He had to help the poor guy. He'd never seen such dreadful suffering. Wait, he cried. You need help. The Can Man just kept going, so Flag chased after him. The image of the horror on the man's arm was still vivid in his mind. As he entered the woods, he could hear the Can Man blundering about in the undergrowth up ahead like a blind, matted bull. Wait! He cried again, as he caught sight of the man in the moonlight, clutching his hand to his chest, whimpering and moaning with shock and horror. Adrenaline-pumped moments passed as Flag ran through the woods, getting closer. Up ahead he could see the ribbon of Route 9, snaking toward Morgan City. The Can Man was making toward the road, but he seemed to have no particular destination. He was just running wildly, as though running would stop the pain he was clearly experiencing. Flag just hoped that he heard the motor first, then he saw the lights moving along the road at a good clip. "Oh shit," he said. "Old man," he screamed. "Watch out!" But the Can Man did not hear him. He did not heed the words. He loped out into the road. Brakes screeched like a banshee's call of doom. Paul Tyler gripped hard at the wheel of his dad's Toyota Celica, trying to get control of himself. God, he was pissed. He took a deep breath as the car barreled through the night. He reached over and turned the radio to the local rock station, letting the power chords of Def Leppard pound from the speakers in the rear. A bright moon floated in the clear sky above. The dense forest hurtled by to either side of the car. After a long silence, Meg Penny finally spoke. "I'm really sorry about my father. I've never seen him like that." Clearly, she was just as embarrassed as Paul was about what happened, and just as eager as he to get to this date back on the track. Paul nodded, then exhaled slowly. "That's okay. Just a misunderstanding. I've made better first impressions, that's for sure. Well, no harm done, I guess, she said, loosening up a bit and leaning back to enjoy the night air rushing through the open window. Wrong, said Paul. Scott Jeski's gonna die. Meg chuckled. You like the idea of the imminent death of a football player, Miss Rah-Rah-Rah? No, the humor of it all is just starting to sink in. The look on Daddy's face, the look on your face, priceless, just priceless. Paul sighed and began to untense, allowing himself to smile. Yeah, I guess maybe it was pretty funny. To think your father, Mr. Straight, selling condoms, and thinking, phew, talk about being hoisted by his own petard, still Scott is going to pay. Meg changed the subject. So tell me about this restaurant that you're taking me to. You know I had to pass on Mom's meatloaf tonight. This better be good. Paul laughed. Oh, yeah. My parents and I go to this place a lot. It's over in Clendell Pass, called the Overlook. They get a lot of the resort business and also passers-by on the highway looking for a nice place to eat. They say the chef actually met Julia Child once. Meg laughed. Now the food isn't bad and the view is nice and there's candles and Dad knows the owner, so we can maybe get a glass of champagne or something. I thought it would be a nice quiet place. I don't know, just to talk. It's not very quiet back at school, and there's always classes to go to, or practice, or other distractions. It's just that, well, I've always felt that maybe you and I, maybe we had a lot to talk about. Oh, what makes you say that, Paul? Paul took in a deep breath. Well, I read a lot. I'm a good reader and a quick reader, so I can put away a book in a day or two. And I've been reading since I was about 4 years old. And every day, Meg, every day, I see a different book under your arm. So anyway, now I've got these whole different worlds my head travels in. Worlds I can't really even talk about with other people. And I thought maybe you had worlds too, and, maybe we could share those worlds. Meg was quiet for a moment. Paul, that's a wonderful thought. Yes, I do like to read, and these days you don't get too many people who enjoy immersing themselves in books, but is that the only reason you asked me out? Heck no, blurted Paul. I think you're the sexiest, most wonderful girl in school. He was immediately embarrassed, and he was glad of the darkness because he knew he was blushing. Meg laughed. For a moment, my faith in the male of the species was being shattered. No, but it's true about the books. It's not just a line, Meg. She patted him on the knee. I know, I'm just teasing you, Paul. A nice glow filled him, and he took a moment to look over at her, outlined in the glow from the headlights. Nice silhouette. Along with her perfume and that sense of warmth near him, Paul realized that his heart was pumping with excitement again. Paul, watch out, she cried. There's a man running across the road. Paul swiveled his gaze back immediately. A figure was jumping out of the shadows to the side of the road up ahead and was headed straight for them. Paul slammed on the brakes and swerved, honking the horn to warn the guy. The man angled, but instead of moving away, he ran straight into the path of the car. All this happened in just a split second, so Paul wasn't able to do anything else. Then the brakes locked. Bang! The front of the Toyota connected with the man, barely clipping him. The man bounced off the car and curled up in the ground to the side. Paul brought the car to a halt. It's not your fault, Paul, said Meg. I saw it. He ran right into you. Well, we've got to help him. They jumped out of the car. The man lay in the middle of the road, holding himself and moaning. Just as Paul was approaching him, he saw another figure rush from the woods onto the road, puffing. In the still-lit headlights, he was able to make out that the figure was that of Brian Flagg. Paul knew Flagg, although more by reputation than anything else. They weren't enemies, but neither were they friends. Brian Flagg was simply the school's primo hood with a juvie record, yet a bit of an outcast. So it was natural that Paul should think that this poor old guy on the pavement here was running away from him. Flagg, Jesus Christ, what did you do to him? Flagg knelt beside the old man. He turned to find that the person who had addressed him was Paul Tyler. Hey, I'm not the one who just bounced him off my car, pal. You're right, said Paul, approaching cautiously, but you chased him into the road. Stop it, both of you, Meg protested, striding out between them. Can't you see this man needs help? Paul knelt down to the side of the old man and helped Brian Flagg to sit him up. Careful, said Flagg. He's got some kind of corrosive shit on his hand. Hey, I've seen this fellow, said Paul. when he grizzled head swung into some light. "This is the can man. His words were stopped by the sight of the man's hand as it came into the light as well. It was dim, so he couldn't see the hand clearly, but there seemed to be some kind of slime all over it. Slime and blood with a hint of bone. "Oh, God," said Meg, seeing it too. "What the hell is that?" "Don't look too close or you'll lose your cookies," said Flag. "I don't know what it is, but old Can Man needs a doctor." "Well, we're not far from the clinic," Meg said, pointing toward the town. "Yeah, then that's where we'll go then," said Paul as they helped the guy toward the Toyota. The man smelled of sweat and blood and bad stuff that Paul couldn't identify. Halfway to the car, the old man started shivering and trembling, as though from a fever. "Take it easy, mister. We're going to get you some help, okay?" A moan bubbled from the man's lips. "From the sky. Fell from the sky." His voice was like sandpaper on sandpaper. "What? What's he saying?" "He's in shock. Let's just go," Meg said. Paul remembered the special class he'd had a couple years ago in CPR and related emergency procedures. "You needed to keep victims of shock warm, didn't you?" "Yeah." "There's a blanket in the back of the car." Meg pulled open the door, reached in, grabbed a blue wool blanket, and gave it to Paul. Flag helped him wrap the can man up, and then they eased him carefully into the back seat. Meg assumed her position in the passenger seat, and Paul was about to run around to the driver's side when he noticed that Brian Flag hadn't moved from the side of the car. "Come on, get in." "What for?" Flag asked. "There's going to be a lot of explaining to do to the doctors, and you're part of it. Now you're going to get in the car, or do I got to make you get in?" Reassuming his tough guy role, Flag pretended he was dusting some dirt from Paul's shoulders. "What's wrong, Tyler? Worried about a little insurance claim on Daddy's car?" "Maybe I will come along, just to make sure you don't lay this whole thing off on me." Meg stuck her head out of the window. "Are you two done? Will you hurry? We've got an emergency here." Paul circled around and got into the driver's seat. When he slammed the door, he saw that Brian had pushed Meg over and was sitting beside her, closing the door behind him. "Hey, Flag, get in the back," Paul demanded. "What?" he said. "Hell, I ain't sitting in the back seat with that thing on the can man's hand." Flag stretched out and draped his hand over the back of Meg's seat. He smiled at Paul. "Whenever you're ready, pal." Gritting his teeth, Paul turned the engine over, stuck the car in gear, and got going. He drove fast and he drove well, as Meg guided, and Brian explained how he'd just been fixing his bike when he'd bumped into the can man, totally out of his mind. "He was trying to hack his hand off with this hand axe. You should have seen it," he said. Meg shuddered. "I'm really glad I didn't." Yeah, so I tried to stop him, but when I got a gander at the stuff on his hand, well, that kind of took the wind out of me. So then he just took off with me chasing him. All in all, I guess it turned out for the best. You guys might not have stopped if he had run into you right in front of you. "I just hope that the doctors at the clinic can help him," said Meg, looking back at the old man in the back seat. "Yeah, I mean, who's going to take care of Morgan City's can problem if the can man kicks the bucket?" said Flag. The Aubrey Daniels Medical Clinic was a flat, long brick building just outside of Morgan City on a fairly isolated stretch of road. An ambulance sat in the driveway beside a parking lot empty except for 2 cars. Paul drove right up in front of the building and, with the help of Brian Flag, hustled the can man, still wrapped in the blanket, his eyes blank and glassy, into the glaring strip lighting and linoleum of the emergency room. The place was deserted except for the night nurse, who sat at her station absorbed in some paperwork and hardly noticed the new arrivals. Paul left the other 2 to keep the can man upright and went to the desk trying to get the nurse's attention. "Excuse me," he said. "One moment," she said. She wore black glasses around a pinched face and her hair was tied into a bun above the matronly bulges in a starched white uniform. She was working intently on some kind of report, scribbling onto a yellow manila folder. Paul impatiently tapped on the counter, then looked back behind him. A strand of drool was rolling from the can man's mouth onto the blanket. "Now, how may I help you?" the nurse asked, putting the folder away and finally deigning to look at Paul. Paul pointed back at the blanketed old man. "This guy needs a doctor right away." "He's got something on his hand," said Meg, some kind of acid or something. The nurse didn't even look at the man. "Does he have Blue Cross?" "I don't think so," Meg said, clearly flustered at such question. "Medical insurance of any kind?" "I don't believe this shit," said Flag, muttering under his breath. Man, this is the can man. He probably checks this place out once in a while, picking up discarded cans. He does a service to you guys, and he needs help." Paul said. For the first time, the nurse looked directly at the man. She wrinkled her nose at the smell as the canned man trembled beneath the blanket, swaying on weak legs. She pressed a buzzer. The doctor on duty is busy with another patient right now, she explained. Almost immediately, a bulky male orderly with a crew cut answered her call. She turned to him. Willie, would you put this gentleman in number 3, please? Willie nodded and took the canned man from Meg and Flag's grasp and steered him to a rolling gurney. He picked the guy up and laid him onto the gurney as if he were a sack of cotton. The canned man began to whimper fearfully, his feverish eyes focusing on Brian Flagg. Take it easy, old dude, said Flagg softly. These guys are going to fix you right up. Paul watched as the old man turned and looked up at Flagg, a glimmer of intelligence and hope in his eye. He quieted down. Paul looked over to Meg, who was studying Flagg, clearly as surprised as Paul at the compassion he displayed. As the orderly wheeled the gurney away, the nurse handed Paul a clipboard holding several blank forms. You'll have to fill these out, she said. Then she went back to her own business inside the station. You think he'll be okay? Meg asked, looking at the door still swinging from the recent exit. Well, he could lose that hand, Paul said. It's up to them now. Brian Flagg, though, seemed to shrug off his concern like a dirty T-shirt. You guys can stick around if you want to. I'm out of here. He headed for the door. Meg shot him a look of disappointment, and Paul thought quickly, what next? They could leave now, sure, but all they'd be thinking about was that groaning old guy with the gunk on his hand. It would ruin their whole evening. This way, if they stayed, well, they wouldn't be eating cordon bleu and sipping underage wine, but they'd be together, and they'd still be able to talk, to get to know each other. Do you mind if we stay for a while just to make sure? Paul asked. Meg swallowed sweetly, looking very beautiful. I was about to ask you the same thing, Paul. Well, let me see if they got a Coke machine nearby. A Diet Orange if they've got it, okay? I'll be sitting over in the waiting area. Right. He stopped, then turned back to her. You know, for a really lucky day for me, my luck swerves around, doesn't it? Lucky, Paul? Yeah, I mean, you say you go out with me. Wonderful luck. She smiled again sexily. Nothing to do with luck there, Paul Tyler. If you hadn't worked up the courage to ask me out in a week or two, I would have asked you. He went off to look for the soda machine, his heart much lighter. As it turned out, though, a clinic waiting room was not a spot particularly conducive to deep conversation. Paul dutifully filled out the forms as best he could, though they really looked funny with just the can man pendant for the name, and the woods near Elkin Groves as the address. He put the forms back on the counter at the nurse's station, but she ignored both him and them. Then he returned to continue and awkwardly talk with Meg. They were both preoccupied, of course. There was no way to ignore the environs, not with those bright fluorescent lights humming into their eyes, not with the medicine and rubbing alcohol smell reminding you where you were. A half hour dragged by as they talked and thumbed through the different magazines lying around the waiting room. Meg was paging through a big thing called Special Report Fiction, and Paul was checking out a Car and Driver magazine. Paul looked over at her. I bet you've had better first dates, huh? I don't mind. That smile again. Wonderful. Hey, you want another soda? Sure, same again, okay? Yeah, no problem. The vending machine was just inside the swinging doors. It was a Pepsi machine, not a Coke machine, but it did have Diet Orange, so Paul wasn't complaining. He dutifully fed the quarters into the slot and punched the buttons. The machine produced the beverage with a rattle and a thump. Another few quarters, this time for a Pepsi, and he put them in. Paul happened to glance up the hospital corridor. It was much as it had been before. At the end of the corridor was the room where they'd put the can man. He was lying on the same gurney there, unattended. He seemed to be unconscious now, not moving at all. Sheesh, thought Paul. The doctor still hasn't gotten around to him. As Paul stared at the man lying on the gurney, something odd happened. There was a strange kind of movement under the blanket, a kind of wobbly flutter. What the hell, Paul thought. Was the guy out, or was he awake? His hands going through spasms for some reason. Leaving the soda in their trays, Paul walked up the corridor to the open room. To one side of the hall there was activity. Soft voices came from the examination room, where a doctor was putting the finishing touches on an old woman's arm cast while he spoke to her gently. Paul walked past, turning his attentions back to the room where the can man lay. Yow! The blanket was heaving up now like a wave. What could be doing that? As he approached, Paul noted that the can man's head was turned away, but just as he entered the small cubicle, the head flopped over to face him. Filmy eyes stared up from a white, skull-like face. A bloody froth bubbled up from within the can man's gaping mouth with a rattling, gurgling sound. "Oh, no," said Paul, stopping dead in his tracks. He went no farther, instead turning and heading back double-quick to the room where the doctor was working. Bounding in, he cried, "Doctor, you've got to come right away!" The doctor looked very annoyed at the intrusion. "Can't you see I'm with a patient here?" Paul pointed down the corridor desperately. "There's a man dying! Please!" Paul grabbed the man's arm and dragged him into the hallway. "Down here," he said. We brought him in earlier." They entered the cubicle, but now there was no movement beneath the blanket. The can man lay still and oblivious to everything, as though sleeping. "Is this the hand injury?" the doctor asked, automatically slipping into professional mode. "Yeah, there was this weird stuff on his hand and—" The doctor took the edge of the blanket and peeled it off. Paul Tyler gasped, but he couldn't take his eyes off what lay below the blanket. Strands of a saliva-like substance clung to the underside of the blanket. "Oh my God," the doctor said. The only part of the can man that was intact was his head. From the neck down, the body was... It was half dissolved. Paul and the doctor stood frozen, staring at the quivering mass that looked like a moldy fruit and gelatin salad layered over a skeleton. The bare bones of the can man's ribcage framed the soupy remains of internal organs, and his spine ended in a lump of twisted white that had once been his pelvis. All the rest was just a mass of steamy gore that wafted up a noxious smell of acrid putrefaction. Paul almost threw up. He staggered back, his mind reeling, but was unable to tear his eyes away from what lay on the gurney. "What the hell is this?" the doctor, aghast, finally said. "That thing on his hand," said Paul. The doctor broke from his paralysis. He ran to the door and hollered for help. "Nurse, get in here!" The thing on his hand, it wasn't there anymore. Where the hell had it gone? He had to find it. The thing was dangerous. Paul sensed that much. The horrible thing was a danger to everyone here in the clinic, maybe even to the whole town. He knew this fact, not so much from logic as from a queasy instinct he'd felt, ever since he first saw that pink blob on the can man's hand. Paul pushed past the doctor, charging into the hall, looking for that thing. It was a living thing. It had to be. It was a living thing, and it had to be found. He hurried down the hall, whizzing past the nurse who had been summoned from her professional stupor by the doctor's call. Paul looked first to the right, then to the left, checking the doorways. A little way down, a door was open. It was an office, and on the desk a phone beckoned. They were going to need help here, no question about that, Paul reasoned. The thing had killed the can man. Killed him in the most horrible way imaginable. If it had killed once, it would kill again. Paul knew he had to call the police, and the sooner the police got there, the better. He went into the office toward the phone. It was hungry. Hunger was the only immediate sensation it knew, and now it was bigger. So was the hunger, grown into a rapacious, ravenous urge that filled every wildly growing and splitting cell in its mass. In the hot place, it had known little, its hunger as small as it was. It had known pain as well, with the heat and the pressure of gravity, but somehow it had thrived desperately, and despite its pain, thrived and survived the screaming thump that had ended its long journey. When the cool night air hit it, it had automatically contracted. The blob had found food. There had been fulfillment there in the first drink of the tissue and corpuscles and the squirt of warmth as the blob's fluid had descended upon the flesh and blood of the hand. Yes, and feeling had come satisfaction, but the blob was weak, and this was its first food, and it took time to feed and to grow. But then in the darkness under the blanket, after the confusing sensations of speed and of other animate forms around it, its cells began to multiply, and it was able to manufacture more fluid, and its feasting was more to commence unabated. But then the blob had sensed something else. It had sensed danger, and so the life-giving essence sucked from its prey. It had departed, aware of the movement of the other animate forms it instinctively knew were not only its food but its enemies. Now it hung at the top of the wall, hiding, waiting. The flesh and blood it had consumed was of poor quality, and so its strength was not great. But now it sensed the presence of a delicious and desirable pile of animate food, fresh and young. With a pseudopod, it gently shut the door behind Paul Tyler as the teenager went to the phone. and then the blob began to crawl up the ceiling. Along with it flowed like an upside-down spill of vomit. The room was sterile, featureless. The only illumination came from the single lamp which cast a pool of light onto the desk and the phone. The ceiling was covered in shadow. Paul Tyler picked up the phone and dialed 911. The phone rang several times before anyone answered. Then Paul heard a woman's voice. "Sheriff's office." "I have to talk to the sheriff," said Paul. "It's an emergency." "One moment," said the woman. There was a pause. Paul took a deep breath and tried to control the fear he could feel crawling up his spine. He had to stay in control. Another voice spoke on the phone. Paul recognized it as the voice of the sheriff. "Geller speaking." Paul felt a great deal of relief hearing that voice. His dad and Herb Geller were bowling buddies. He'd known Herb Geller since he was a kid, and the officer used to give him rides in the bubble top. "Sheriff, this is Paul Tyler." "Paul? Well, what's the matter, son?" "I'm at the Daniels Clinic. An old man's just been killed out here." Paul had taken up a pencil on the desk. He was nervously tapping the eraser against a pad of clinic stationery. He did not notice the 2 globs of moisture that dropped onto the edge of the desk, nor the small plumes of steam that rose up as the fluid ate into the wood. "You said killed?" "Yes, sir," said Paul. "Okay, you sit tight and I'll be right out. Now, who else is involved?" "I'm with Meg Penny, and Brian Flagg was here earlier." The sheriff's voice rose with suspicion. "Flagg? Where is he now?" 2 more drops of fluid fell onto the desk. 2 more wisps of smoke grew, and this time Paul Tyler noticed. What? The ceiling was dripping or something. "I don't know," he said into the phone. Paul looked up. It was hanging there, just above the lamp. It looked like a monstrous red slug, glistening with a sheet of moisture, a soft glimmer in the light. Another spatter of moisture dropped onto Paul's hand, and the droplet burned his skin. He looked back up in horror, frozen, unable to do anything. The blob dropped on him like a cloak of phlegm. Paul Tyler screamed. Meg Penny sat in the waiting room, flipping through the magazine and waiting for her diet orange soda. She wondered what was keeping Paul. He should have been back by now, she reasoned. Something was wrong. The doctor had called the nurse, and the nurse had gone running. Since then, there had been silence. The clinic felt spooky now to Meg, as if something was about to happen, something bad. She was worried about Paul. Even though this date had taken a bad turn, it wasn't Paul's fault. He was a good guy. She knew that much now. Good and conscientious. There was plenty of time for more dates, and Meg Penny knew that she wanted to go out with Paul Tyler again. But they had to get through this nasty business first. That old man, that horrible gunk on his hand, it made Meg sick just to remember it. The way it had eaten away his hand. It was terrible. Being alone in the room made Meg nervous. She had to see what was going on. Besides, Paul had been gone a long time. She got up and walked toward the swinging door into the clinic corridor. Maybe after this all was taken care of, they should just call it a night and Paul could take her home. That would shock Daddy all right, especially after what he'd been thinking after the ludicrous condom thing. Maybe she could show Paul some of her collection of books and the beautiful classical record collection she listened to often. Meg saw the doctor and the nurse at the end of the hallway, huddled over the gurney that held the can man. Meg couldn't see what they were doing, so she started to walk toward them. Maybe Paul was with them, she reasoned, and he could tell her what was going on and how long it was going to be before they could leave this place. Then from a nearby office, she heard the scream. Paul's scream. It didn't last long, for almost as soon as it started, it was muffled. But it lasted long enough for Meg to tell exactly which office it came from, and she hurried to the door, twisted the knob, and pushed through. The lamp had fallen to the floor, and its glow was thrown across the tile and upward, glaring in the young woman's eyes, casting swaths of light surrealistically across a scene straight from hell. Paul Tyler lay on the floor, and something was on top of him. It was pink and translucent, a massive glob of gunk that trembled and contracted around Paul, and it was alive. "Paul!" she cried. A gurgle, squishing noises sounded, along with the slap of protoplasm against linoleum as the teenager desperately flopped and struggled against the gelatinous thing enfolding him as some massive flytrap might an insect. And it was pulling him across the floor, this mass, pulling him toward an open window. A faint breeze through the window carried an awful odor back to Meg, the stink of acid and blood. Paul had managed to push a naked arm free of his attacker, and he reached out for help. Meg raced up to him and grabbed his hand, pulling, trying to prevent the globular creature from dragging him out the window. But even as she pulled hard, she could see what was happening to Paul inside the monster. His skin, it was corroding, just like the can man's hand. But this time the entire body of a healthy teenager was being consumed. "No," she cried, "no!" And she tugged for all she was worth, trying to pull Paul from beneath the writhing organism. But the thing was incredibly strong. It carried her along with it, toward the open window. Then something gave. She felt herself hurtling back, thumping onto the floor, lights exploding in her vision. As her vision cleared, she realized that she was still holding Paul Tyler's hand. She had pulled him free. Meg looked down at the end, attached to the naked arm, attached to nothing. She was holding Paul Tyler's severed arm. Gasping, unable to do anything, filled with revulsion and terror, she looked up and saw the blob slurping up the side of the window to the sill, and inside it, like a dying baby in a dissected womb, his features melting away within the nauseous slime, hung Paul Tyler. Then, with a flop and a loud liquid sound, the monster was gone, leaving a spore of blood behind it. Only when she looked down at Paul's arm and realized it was pulsing in her grip, as she thought clinging desperately to life, did Meg Penny scream. Surrounded by a night alive with flashing red emergency lights and milling people, Sheriff Herb Geller strode from the clinic entrance toward the group of stunned people. He still didn't believe what he had seen. God, the can man? He'd never seen a body in worse shape, and Herb Geller had seen his share of bodies, too. And Paul, little Paul Tyler, Chet Tyler's kid, dead and gone, leaving behind only his arm. Geller had looked at the arm, too. It looked as though it had been eaten through with acid at the biceps. What kind of madman would be throwing acid around, for Christ's sakes? It must have been what happened to the can man. Got splashed with some kind of acid. Herb Geller just wanted to head into the nearest toilet stall and have a talk with the commode. But his pride kept down his dinner, and his badge kept up his professionalism as he walked outside to talk with Paul's date. Meg was in the parking lot with her mother and father. She stood sobbing into Peg Penny's arms, sobbing and babbling hysterically. "It's awful! A monster!" she was saying. Now, dear," said Mr. Penny. "You said the room was dark. You don't know for sure." Meg Penny looked up with a tear-streaked face. "But I saw it. It got Paul. It covered him. Ate him." "Shh," said Peg Penny, trying to offer comfort. Mr. Penny saw Geller approaching and separated himself from the others. "Sheriff," he said, catching him halfway, and speaking in a low voice, "how about it? Can we take her home?" Penny's face looked lined and old with worry. "You might as well," Geller said. "Make sure she gets some sleep. Maybe she'll start making some sense in the morning." "Yes, thanks, Herb," Penny said, turning back and ushering his wife and daughter to the family station wagon parked nearby. Geller watched them for a moment, then felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned and found Deputy Bill Briggs standing behind him, a few beads of perspiration dotting the forehead of his young black face. "You let her go?" asked Briggs. "Oh, yeah, we're not going to get anything out of her tonight. She's hysterical. She's going on and on about shapes and monsters or whatever." "I got a call on to Paul Tyler's folks," said Briggs, nervously rubbing his neat mustache. "They haven't heard from him." Geller cleared his throat. "Let's face it, Bill, they're not going to." He thought about that arm, and he thought about little Paulie Tyler and how much he'd loved the special police carnival, and how Geller had piggybacked them all around the Ferris wheel and the carousel and the hot dog stand. "I want the rest of his body found before dawn." It was the least he could do for Chet and his wife. As they walked back toward the clinic, a couple of white uniformed guys were wheeling a black body bag out to the ambulance idling at the lip of the runway. A paramedic with a crew walking alongside saw Geller and handed him a form connected to a clipboard. Geller signed the form. "Get those to Denver tonight, and I need an autopsy pronto, not next week." "Right," said the paramedic, taking the clipboard back and helping with the body bag. Geller watched as the doors were closed and the men took their places in the cab. The ambulance rushed off in a storm of noise and lights. He took a deep breath, and then put his official stance aside for a while, and closed his eyes, letting himself be stunned, forgetting he was sheriff, and focusing only on the fact that he was a human being who had just been confronted by pure horror. Jesus wept, he murmured softly. "Herb," said Briggs at his side, "you okay?" "Tyler was a good kid," he said. "I want the son of a bitch that did this." Just then a highway patrol car screeched into the parking lot from off the road, its red light revolving. Geller did not have to move to see who was sitting in the back seat. Mr. Juvie Hall himself, wearing handcuffs. Brian Flagg. "Maybe we've already got him," said Bill. "Yeah," said Geller, his anger and his sense of outrage obscuring everything else in his head. "Maybe so." He saw Meg Penny getting into her family car nearby, noticing the patrol car coming in. He saw that she looked alarmed when she saw Brian Flagg being led out from the car. Flagg saw her too, and there seemed to be an expression of hopelessness and anger in his usually blank face. And of accusation? What the hell had been going on with those kids? Some kind of weird ritual involving dousing the can man in acid or something? Geller had read weirder things in the newspaper, but he'd never thought that something like this could happen in Morgan City. And then the penny car drove off, and the suspect was brought before the sheriff. "Hello, Flagg," said Geller. "We got some serious talking to do, boy, and if I hear an ounce of attitude—" He lifted his fist. "God help me, I'll give you a pound of knuckles." Brian Flagg said nothing. All in all, Scott Jeske was very pleased. The date with Vicky DeSoto was going exactly according to plan. If all went well at this delicate stage of negotiations, he'd be in the saddle in just a matter of minutes, and then he'd be home by midnight, where he could chalk another victory mark up on his hit board. He'd parked his battered white 63 Impala on top of Lakey Ridge, a classic lover's lane overlooking Morgan City. The date was supposed to have been for a movie, but he'd managed to nix that pretty quick, getting on to more active aspects of teen courting by feeding Vicky a drink. She'd taken it all right, and she liked it. They always did, the ones he was able to convince anyway. Painless punch, he'd called it, his own special concoction. Then he'd convince her that it was such a gorgeous night, they shouldn't be wasting it inside some stuffy, boring movie, but should enjoy the fresh air, the night sky. And so, off to a place where just an absolutely wonderful view would be, and they could just sit and talk. Vicky had swallowed it, hook, line, and another drink. "I can't tell you how agonizing it is," Scott Jeske was saying, leaning toward his groggy date. "I guess what I really just need is a shoulder to cry on. The thought of all those years I was cut off. I didn't have the courage to tell people about how I was starving for physical affection." He leaned over and put his hand around her shoulder, while the other hand crept up her stocking to the hem of her high-riding skirt. She regarded this movement with giggly bemusement for a moment. Then his hand shot out for home base, triggering a cry of protest. "Scott, cut it out," she said, slapping his hand away. "I'll kiss you, I told you, but that's the limit." "What? But kisses? My heart kisses your heart. My soul kisses your lips. My fingers kiss your lovely, frilly underwear." She moved over to the door, pushing him away, her huge breasts rising up with alarm beneath her tight blouse. With a finger she described a line across her midsection. "That's the imaginary line, and you can't cross it." Scott blinked. "Line? What are you, Libya?" "Look, I like you, Scott, and you make me feel like too. I told you we could go steady for a while. Isn't that enough?" "Steady? Come on, Vicky, you're wearing my ring now. That makes you my girl." That painless punch had really done the trick, along with the football game today. She was really aching for a boyfriend, and apparently she really did like him. He thought for just a moment that maybe he could take it easy tonight, just get to know her, enjoy a few easygoing, no-tension dates, but the thought did only last for a moment. "It is a nice ring," said Vicky, admiring the glitter at the end of the necklace hanging from her neck. "I do like it, Scott." "Thank God it doesn't have to breathe," Scott said, looking at the way it was stuffed between the mounds of her breasts. "Of course, that wouldn't be a bad way to go. Now come here, baby. You don't want to be traumatized by me, do you?" But she pulled away from his embrace, attracted by something. She pointed out through the fogged-up window, down the hill past the woods. "Hey, what are all those lights down there? Isn't that the hospital?" "Nah, it's probably just some promotional gimmick. They're giving away free tonsillectomies or something." He made another lunge, but she dodged. Boy, the lady sure was cooling. What's the matter, Scott wondered. Then he noticed the empty cocktail glass by the gear shift. Of course, the painless punch was wearing off. "Say, young lady, I think you're ready for another one of my famous cherry coolers." "I think I've had enough," she murmured. "Nonsense." He pushed open the door, got out the door, and went around to the trunk and made her another one. It sensed food. It was still hungry, and it sensed the pair of animate foodstuffs in that frame of metal and glass atop the hill. It undulated toward the car, the remains of Paul Tyler still digesting within its mass, like a lump in the stomach of a glass python. Food. It slithered up the metalwork, and it sensed an opening. A narrow opening, true, but it could rearrange its cells so they could squeeze through. It lifted itself and pushed through the bottom of the door jamb, and it immediately sensed the warmth and smell of the pulsing blood and skin and flesh, and another smell, astringent, odd. Inside the car, as the blob oozed through the window and door below her, Vicky DeSoto dozed, doped to the gills with Scott Jeski's alcohol, unaware of her creeping death hissing below her. Scott Jeski opened the trunk. A two-tiered homemade bar unfolded, complete with ice chest and swizzle sticks. Nearby, in a little box, hung his collection of cheap school rings. A deadly combination committed to alcohol. They opened up a girl's heart, and everything else, almost every time. Scott grabbed a bottle of 150 proof Everclear grain alcohol and a bottle of cherry juice. "My own special blend of fine imported liqueurs," he pronounced as he poured the drink. "Voila! Painless punch. Cherry cooler. Whatever you call it. It packed a wallop." He took out an old egg beater and whipped the mix to a froth, added some ice cubes and a cherry, and it was ready for round 3. Yes, sir. One more of these babies tucked away in her tummy, and Vicky DeSoto would be wanting to take advantage of him. He slammed the trunk, sipped the drink to make sure it wasn't too poisonous, and then cruised around to the driver's side of the Impala, where he eased back in, his offering ready for the lady's consumption. "Just the thing to beat the heat," he pronounced. Even as he said this, he noticed that it was rather hot in the car. "It's like a steam bath in here," he commented. Geez, just a few of his kisses on her voluptuous lips could do this. Wow. He turned to his date and held out the concoction. She was slumped on the seat. "Vicky?" No reaction. "Vicky, here's your drink." Looked like she was out cold. There she lay, her low-cut dress showing off enough feminine attributes through her blue cotton blouse to make 2 girls happy, and a lot of guys deliriously ecstatic. He put the drink down. Nope, he couldn't pass up this opportunity. He scooted over and put his arm around her nonchalantly. "Yup, hot as a dog out there tonight. Weird for September, don't you think?" "Vicky?" Still no reaction. She wasn't waking up. "It's a nice blouse. Good material. It must be awful hot, though," he said, reaching over and undoing a button. "Yow, lots of creamy skin. The hint of more. The very sight got him hot, got his heart pumping." "That's better, huh?" "But no? Well, maybe one more." He undid another button. Not a peep from Vicky. Oh man, what a chance. To touch those hooters, get a grip on paradise. Boy, what a charge. He went for it, slipping his hand down deep into her blouse, expecting the thrilling touch of a bra to give way to the feel of a nipple in his... He heard it before he felt it. A wet, squishing sound. His hand felt something give, something like sticking into a vat warm of gelatin. Then he realized that in his enthusiasm he'd pushed too far, and... No, that couldn't be. What the hell? Had Vicky been sweating so much that his hand had slipped down into her abdomen? No, it was at the wrong angle. His hand and his arm had gone straight through her. Before this fact could fully register, though, the instinct to pull out came over Scott Jeski. He drew his hand back through the squishy stuff, and then something grabbed it. He couldn't move his arm. Something tight and hard held his arm by his wrist, held it fast. "What?" he said. Then Vicky's body, pale white in the moonlight, streaming through the fogged windows, began to tremble. Her face lolled towards Scott, as though seeking another of his wet and sloppy kisses, but instead of an invitation from those rogue lips, there came a bloody froth bubbling up. "Oh, God, no! No!" Scott's words turned into a scream. He pulled away again, more desperate now, but with a greater tug, the something inside Vicky DeSoto's dead body yanked back, jerking him to the elbow, the forearm, right into the girl's face. His arm vanished all the way into her body, even as kind of a steam hissed around him, and a foul acid smell filled the confines of the car. Then he realized through his terror that his arm felt as though it had been soaked in kerosene and touched with a match. He screamed louder. A crunch! Vicky's torso fell into itself, collapsing. The features of her face started disappearing, eaten away from behind her skull. A bulbous, bloody mucus seeped up from the ruined eye sockets, the distended nostrils, the once inviting lips splashing with a searing impact on the Scott Jeski's face. He was pulled, kicking and screaming, into the horrible mess that Vicky DeSoto's body had become. His flailing foot hit the side window so hard that it smashed it. It quivered there against the sill for a few seconds, and then it was drawn in, limp. The screams stopped, and the sucking, sopping sounds grew louder. Steam rose from the window and was pushed away by a light mountain breeze as the moon glittered and shone on the surging, feasting creature within the Impala.